And stay with me until the end, because this story doesn't start where you'd expect it to. Lena Forsythe was 26 years old the morning her father sold her. He didn't call it that. He called it a settlement, called it the only way, called it a lot of things, standing in the kitchen of the farmhouse outside of Lethbridge, his hat in his hands, his eyes on the floor. But Lena knew what it was. She'd heard him on the porch the night before, talking to a man named Doyle in a low voice that carried further than he realized. She'd sat on the top stair in the dark and listened and understood exactly what was being arranged. Her father owed money he didn't have. The land was mortgaged twice. The creditors were coming in the spring. And Doyle needed a wife before he could collect on an inheritance his uncle had left him. Something about a clause in the will, something about respectability. He was 43, twice widowed, and nobody in 3 counties would marry him willingly. So there it was. Lena packed one bag. She took her mother's wool shawl, a Bible she didn't much read but couldn't leave behind, and a photograph of herself and her younger brother taken the summer he turned 8. She didn't take anything that couldn't fit in a canvas bag, because she knew, in the way you know things you'd rather not, that this was not a temporary arrangement. The morning of the ceremony, she stood in the back room of the church in Claresholm and looked at her own face in a small mirror someone had left leaning against the wall. She looked older than 26. Or maybe just tired in a way that read as older. The Reverend had agreed to perform the service with no questions asked, which told her everything she needed to know about him. Doyle's man was in the front pew. 3 of them, actually. They'd come as witnesses, they said. But the way they positioned themselves near the door made witnesses sound like the wrong word. That was when the back door of the church opened. She didn't hear footsteps so much as she felt the change in the room, a shift in air, the way a space adjusts when someone large enters it. She turned, and there was a man standing in the doorway she had never seen before in her life. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the frame. His coat was dirty from the road. His jaw was set like he'd already made a decision and wasn't interested in revisiting it. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he walked past her, straight into the main room of the church, and she heard his voice, low and carrying, say, "Reverend, this service isn't going to happen today." What followed was not quiet. There was shouting. There was the sound of a bench scraping hard across stone floor. There was Doyle's voice. A high, mean sound, nothing like the controlled murmur she'd heard on her father's porch. And then a silence that was somehow louder than the shouting had been. She walked to the doorway and looked in. The man was standing in the center aisle. Doyle's 3 men had not moved from where they were, but they also had not advanced, which told her something about the man in the aisle. Doyle was on his feet, face red. "Who in God's name are you?" "My name is Cade Whitfield." He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way you state a fact you've already grown tired of explaining. "And that woman is my wife." She was not his wife. She learned this approximately 4 minutes later, when he walked her out of the church by the elbow and put her on a horse she didn't recognize, and they rode north out of Claresholm at a pace that made conversation impossible. She held on and said nothing, and waited. When he finally slowed, they were in open country, the foothills coming up to the west, the sky enormous and gray and pressing down the way it does in April in southern Alberta. "I'm going to explain," he said. "Good," said Lena. Cade Whitfield had ridden through Claresholm 2 days before. He'd heard about the arrangement. It was the kind of small-town business that traveled fast. And he'd heard something else too, which was that Doyle had been involved in a land grab a few years back that had pushed 3 families off their property through forged documentation. One of those families was connected to a man Cade had known a long time ago. He owed that man a debt he hadn't found a way to repay. He was not a saint, he told her. He was not doing this from pure goodness. She appreciated that more than she could say. "Where are we going?" she asked. "North." He paused. "I have land. Near Pincher Creek. You can stay until you figure out what you want to do next." Lena looked at the horizon. Behind them, Claresholm was a smudge. Ahead was a very large amount of nothing, which in that moment felt like freedom in a way that nothing had in years. "All right," she said. The cabin was not what she'd imagined when he said he had land. It was solid. She'd give him that. The logs were well fitted, the roof sound. But it was the home of a man who had lived alone for a long time, and it showed in ways that were both practical and sad. The single chair positioned at the best angle for the fire, the 1 cup on the shelf, the stack of books that had been read and reread until the spines had gone soft. There were no curtains. The window faced west, and he'd clearly decided that was enough. She stood in the center of the main room and took stock. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 8 years. Shh. She didn't ask about before, not yet. He gave her the back room, which had a cot and a small wood stove of its own. He was formal about it, almost awkward, and she realized that the confidence she'd seen in the church was a specific kind of confidence, the kind that worked in emergencies and then went quiet. In ordinary life, in the small negotiations of two people sharing a space, he was less certain. That first night, she sat on the cot and listened to the wind work at the corners of the cabin and thought, this is not a life, not yet. But it could be something. She was not a woman who waited for things to become better on their own. In the morning, she found the kitchen, such as it was, and took inventory. He was watching her from the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm not going to be in your way," she said, "but I'm also not going to sit still." He almost smiled. "Almost. I didn't think you would." The weeks that followed were not easy, and she would not have said they were happy, not exactly, but there was something in them. A shape she didn't have a word for yet. She learned the land. Not because he taught her in any formal way, but because she watched and asked questions and went out in the early mornings when he was already working to understand what he was doing and why. The property ran up into the foothills, and there was a creek on the east side that froze solid by November and ran clear and fast by April. He ran cattle, not many, but enough. He knew every animal by the small differences in their markings, which was the kind of attention to detail that told her something about what kind of man he was when nobody was watching. He talked to her, but not too much. That was something she hadn't expected, that she would find the silence comfortable rather than cold. She'd grown up in a house with a father who filled every quiet moment with noise that didn't mean anything, and she'd learned to brace for it without knowing she'd learned it. Cade's silences felt different. They felt like he was thinking, not retreating. One evening, 6 weeks in, she asked him what had happened to bring him out here alone. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My brother," he finally said. "We had a falling out, over land, over money." He stopped, started again. "Over a woman too, if I'm being honest, though that part is over and has been for a long time." "Do you regret coming here?" "No," he said it without hesitation. "I regret how I left, not where I ended up." She nodded. That distinction felt important. The trouble found them on a Tuesday in late June, which she would remember later as the day everything that had been quiet became loud. A man named Doyle had not forgotten. She should have known he wouldn't. Men like that don't absorb a public humiliation and let it settle. He'd sent 2 men to find out where she'd gone, and they'd done their job, and now those men were at the south gate of the property with a letter from Doyle's lawyer, claiming that the arrangement in Claresolm had been a binding verbal contract, and that she was legally obligated to return. Cade read the letter twice, then he handed it to her. She read it once and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This isn't real," she said. "There was no contract." "No," Cade said, "but Doyle has money and a lawyer, and we have neither. We have something else." He looked at her. "My father," she said. "He knew things about Doyle. Real things. The land grabs you mention, there were others. I heard them talking. I didn't understand all of it at the time, but I remember it." She could see him working through it. "Your father would have to talk," he said carefully. "My father," she said, "is a man who sold his daughter to clear a debt. But he's also a man who still has a son at home, and a farm he loves, and I think if someone explained to him clearly enough what happens if Doyle gets what he wants, what it means for all of them, he might find his backbone." Cade was quiet then. "You'd have to go back." "I know. I'll go with you." She hadn't expected that. She told herself she hadn't expected it, and found out in that moment she was wrong. She had been hoping, underneath the practicality, in a quiet place she hadn't looked at directly. She'd been hoping he would say exactly that. "All right," she said, steady. The way he'd taught her without meaning to teach her anything. The ride to Lethbridge took 2 days. They slept in the open the first night, the sky above them wide and full of stars, the fire small and warm between them. She couldn't sleep, and neither could he, and after a while they gave up pretending and just talked, really talked, for the first time, without the shape of the cabin around them and the small negotiations of daily proximity. He told her about his brother. He told her about the woman who'd come between them, who had in fact chosen neither of them in the end, which he said now with something that sounded like peace rather than bitterness. She told him about her mother, who'd died when Lena was 14, and how the house had changed after that in ways that were hard to describe. except to say that the warmth had gone out of it. She told him about her brother, who was 17 now and decent, and who she was afraid would turn into their father if someone didn't give him a better example. Cade listened. He didn't say much, but the quality of his listening was something she recognized. It was the same attention he gave the land, and the animals, the kind that didn't miss details. When they reached Lethbridge, her father opened the door and went pale. He'd heard from Doyle's men. He knew what was coming. He looked at Lena and then at Cade, standing behind her, and something shifted in his face. She didn't let him speak first. She told him everything she knew, everything she'd overheard, everything she'd pieced together. She laid it out plainly and without anger, because anger was a luxury she'd decided not to spend on him. And then she told him what she needed. He was quiet for a long time. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same calculation she'd always known was there, the assessment of risk and benefit, of self-interest. She waited. "There are letters," he finally said. "He sent me letters when we first started talking. I kept them. I don't know why." He looked at his hands. "I should have been better. I know that." "Yes," she said, not cruelly, just truthfully. They left with the letters. What came next took 3 weeks and was not dramatic. It was paperwork and a meeting with a solicitor in Calgary, who turned out to be the kind of man who took real interest in cases involving forged documentation, and a long conversation with 2 other families who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Doyle's lawyer withdrew the letter. The arrangement that had been called a contract was never mentioned again. She and Cade rode home on a Thursday afternoon, with the light going gold across the foothills and the creek running high with snowmelt from the mountains. He stopped at the gate and looked at the property, the cabin, the barn, the fields going east toward the flat, and she stopped beside him. "You don't have to stay," he said, not looking at her. "You've got options now. The land's settled. The threat is gone." She looked at him, at his profile, which she knew well by now, the set of his jaw, the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into Alberta sun and wind. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "For me to go?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched. "No," he said, "it's not." "Then stop giving me an out," she said, "and ask me to stay." He turned and looked at her then, really looked at her, and she held his gaze and waited. "Stay," he said. "All right," she said. The wedding was small. Her brother came, which meant more to her than she had words for. A neighbor couple from the next property over came as witnesses, Maud and Gordon, who had been married 40 years and still bickered affectionately about everything, and seemed happier than anyone Lena had ever met. The reverend who agreed to perform the ceremony was not the one from Claresholm. He was an older man from Fort Macleod who asked sensible questions and seemed pleased by the answers. Cade held her hand through the vows, and she felt him grip slightly tighter when it came to the words about staying, about choosing, about all the days ahead. After, Maud pulled her aside and said, "He's been alone a long time, long enough that I was worried about him. Honestly, there's a kind of loneliness that calcifies, you know, becomes its own structure." She looked across the yard, to where Cade was talking to Lena's brother, his posture relaxed in a way Lena recognized as recent. "I don't think it calcified with him. I think he was just waiting for the right reason." Lena looked too. Her brother was laughing at something Cade had said. Cade wasn't laughing out loud, but he was close to it the way he got when something genuinely amused him. "I think so too," she said. The first winter together was hard in the practical ways. The snow came early, and the cattle needed constant attention. And there were 3 weeks in January when the temperature dropped low enough that getting water was a daily negotiation with the cold. But there was a different quality to hardship when it was shared. She'd always known this in theory. She understood it in her bones now. He learned she was good with the ledgers. Better than him, he admitted without embarrassment, which was itself a thing she admired about him. She took over the accounts. He built a proper bookshelf in the back room, because she'd arrived with 4 books and now had 11, and the cot-side stack was becoming precarious. The cabin acquired curtains, eventually. Blue wool ones, from a bolt she found in Pincher Creek. He looked at them for a long moment when she put them up and said nothing. And she thought for a moment she'd overstepped, and then he said, "My mother had curtains like that." Quietly, like a door opening just slightly. In the spring, she planted a kitchen garden. He helped without being asked, which she took to mean something. Her brother came for 2 weeks in July, and by the end of it had decided he wanted to work land of his own. Cade spent an evening with him going through what he knew about the properties available in the area, seriously, as though the conversation mattered. and she watched from across the room and felt something she recognized eventually as gratitude of a specific kind. The kind you feel when someone treats the people you love with the same care they give you. The years settled into their shape. There were children. Two, eventually, a daughter first and then a son, and the cabin expanded in stages. A new room here, a covered porch there, until it no longer looked like the home of a man who'd expected to be alone. It looked like what it was. A place built by two people who had chosen each other on purpose, repeatedly, in the small decisions as much as the large ones. Lena's father came once, when the children were small. He held his granddaughter with the careful uncertainty of a man not sure he deserved the privilege. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't explain himself. He stayed 2 days, and when he left he said only, "I'm glad you're all right." It was not enough. It was also, she understood by then, everything he had. She let it be enough. Cade watched him go and then looked at her. She shook her head slightly, meaning, "I'm fine." He nodded, meaning, "I see you." That was the language they'd built, over years, in silences and small movements, and the accumulated weight of paying attention to each other. It was not the language of grand gestures. It was something more useful than that. Her daughter grew up knowing how to read a creek for flood risk, and how to keep accounts in 2 different ledgers, and how to hold a position in a room without raising her voice. Her son grew up knowing how to listen, really listen, and how to do hard physical work without complaint, and how to ask for help when he needed it, which his grandfather had never learned, and which his father had once forgotten, and had relearned, slowly, over years, with patience and with love. There was an evening when they were both getting older. The children grown and gone to lives of their own in the way children do, when Lena stood at the window. Blue curtains, 3rd pair by then, the wool wearing out every decade or so, and looked at the property in the last of the October light. The foothills, the creek, the barn Cade had rebuilt twice, in which now stood sounder than ever. Everything that had come from a morning in a church in Clara's home, when a stranger had walked through a door and changed the direction of her life. She heard him come in behind her, felt him stop at her shoulder. "Still glad you stayed?" she asked. She felt more than heard the sound he made, something between a breath and a laugh. "Still glad you let me ask you," he said. She reached back and found his hand, without looking, and they stood there in the quiet of what they'd built, while the light went long and amber across the land, and everything was still. I keep thinking about the moment Lena stood in that back room of the church. 1 bag packed, 1 cracked mirror, no real plan. She didn't know Cade was coming. She didn't know anything was going to change that morning. And yet something in her had already decided, without words, that she wasn't going to let fear make her choices for her anymore. That's what stays with me about her story. There's a version of Lena's life where she walks out of that church with Doyle, where she tells herself it's practical, where she learns to take up as little space as possible and calls it surviving. A lot of people make that choice, not because they're weak, but because nobody shows up when they need it most, and after a while, you stop expecting anyone to. But Cade showed up, and I think what made the difference wasn't just him. It was that Lena was someone worth showing up for. She'd kept her integrity intact through everything her father had put her through. She hadn't become bitter or dishonest or small. When Cade brought her to that cabin in the foothills, she didn't sit and wait to be told what her life would look like. She learned the land. She asked questions. She took over the ledgers. She planted a garden. She moved through the world like someone who understood that your character is the one thing circumstances can't take from you. And that understanding, quiet and unannounced as it was, is what drew him to her in the first place. That's how I think cause and effect actually works in a life. Not in grand dramatic reversals, but in the accumulation of small, honest choices. Lena told her father the truth without cruelty. She went back to Lethbridge not for revenge, but for resolution. She handled the legal situation with clear-headedness rather than panic. Every one of those moments came from the same source. A kind of inner steadiness that she'd built, probably without knowing she was building it, over years of having to figure things out alone. And Cade. 8 years alone in those foothills, which sounds like giving up but wasn't. He was paying attention to things. To the land, to the animals, to the shape of what a life built on honest work actually looks like. When he heard about Lena's situation, he didn't calculate what he'd get out of intervening. He thought about a debt he owed a friend, and about what was right. That kind of instinct doesn't come from nowhere. It's the result of a long, quiet process of deciding who you want to be and then being it, even when no one's watching. What I find most honest about their story is that it doesn't pretend love solved anything on its own. It was love plus grit, plus the willingness to think clearly under pressure, plus the courage to go back to hard places and finish what needed finishing. Lena brought all three of those things to that marriage. So did Cade, and because they did, what they built lasted. Not just in the cabin and the cattle and the kitchen garden, but in their daughter who could read a creek and keep 2 sets of books, and their son who knew how to listen. The things we build with our best qualities don't stay with us, they go forward. That's the only kind of legacy I think is worth leaving.